okay? No.
It was very beautiful.
It is. And keep it in mind. And keep it in mind as you deal with your neighbors. If you're having a bad time with them, that song should echo in the back of your mind. They're going to know I'm a Christian because I'm still going to love them. So let's move on to the New Testament scripture. And we've now lost our slides, so just read it off of your insert, okay? And that's just fine. In today's New Testament scripture, we take note that Jesus is answering a Pharisee's question. The Pharisees trying to trap him. And Jesus first quotes Deuteronomy 6:5, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." And then Leviticus 19:18, today's scripture. He does this because one cannot happen without the other. True love demands giving yourself to God and his mission, which means giving up selfishness. This is a hard concept, but it's so important in these times that I want to be sure we understand it. These two commandments are the greatest because all Scripture hangs on them. In other words, nothing in Scripture can stick with us or be truly obeyed unless these two are observed. Love God more than anything and love your neighbor as yourself. The entire biblical revelation demands total allegiance to God, loving him and loving one's neighbor. Now, at this time in Jesus' life, Jesus is still experiencing the opposition from the religious leaders, as he has from the very beginning of his ministry. As a consequence of his cleansing of the temple and his great popularity with the crowds that just swell and follow him everywhere, the opposition became much more direct. This section we're going to read today begins with a challenge from the chief priests and the elders. They ask the big question regarding Jesus' authority. The unwillingness of the religious leaders to answer the question Jesus throws back to them indicates that they were not truly interested in the issue of Jesus' authority, but only in maintaining their status among the people. Jesus replies with the double love command. Jesus replies with the double love command, which encapsulates the entire Hebrew Bible, all the law and all the prophets. Loving God with every aspect of one's being and loving one's neighbor as oneself, which forms the very core of Christian ethics. Now let us hear the words. Mark, when I'm done with this scripture, would you come and turn the projector off? There's no sense in having it and then put the screen up. Because everything else is in the bulletin. Okay? This is from Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Thus ends the reading of the New Testament scripture. May we be enlightened because of its message. And while Mark is doing technical things, I will have a drink. Thank you. Then we can see the cross. Did any of you notice the title of today's sermon by any chance? It's kind of, Mark did. Mark actually questioned it when I told him. As yourself. As yourself. Today's sermon examines part 2 of the Great Commandment of both God and as told again by Jesus, the passage from Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And today we're going to explore what that really means. This verse is much more than a simple call to kindness. It is a divine command that stretches far beyond casual conformity to a law. I view it as demanding a transformational change in how we live, how we interact, and how we love. Love your neighbor as yourself. Let me start by sharing a simple story. Imagine this. You regularly help out at the local food pantry. You donate to your church. You visit people in nursing homes, and you try to show grace to everyone around you. It's in your heart to do these things, and these are wonderful acts of Christian service. But today I want to challenge you with the idea that they might not be enough. Oh no! We are already exhausted. Why isn't all that good stuff we're doing enough? Because this commandment calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Let's explore the phrase, as yourself, for that is the key. And start with a question. What is loving yourself? What is loving yourself? It's a clever way that God invites us to think more deeply about how we love others and how to love our own selves. You see, this command assumes something quite fundamental about human nature. It assumes that we already know that we should love ourselves and how we love ourselves. That loving yourself is automatic, it's innate, it's built in. But let's not take that for granted. For it is clear to anyone with eyes that many people clearly do not love themselves, biblically or otherwise. You've seen people with self-hate, haven't you? You know what I mean. You see it. If you don't see it next door, you see it in the movies. You see people with razor blades and they cut themselves. I've never understood that until this class I was just in at seminary. They cut themselves because the pain inside is so deep that that's the only way they can take their mind off the pain that's eating them up on the inside, is to hurt themselves. Do these people love themselves? What does it mean to love yourself? Loving yourself biblically is not about vanity or self-centeredness. It doesn't mean loving the way you look in the mirror or taking pride in superficial things like your hair or your clothes or your car. I'm concerned with all those things. I fix my hair, I drive a nice car, and I wear decent clothes. But that's not loving myself. Loving yourself means taking care of your body's health, nurturing your emotional well-being, but especially tending to your spiritual life. It might also include giving your body appropriate rest. It means forgiving yourself for past mistakes and accepting that you're a work in progress until the day you die. And being kind to yourself, not tearing yourself apart for your mistakes, your inabilities, your weaknesses, your frailties. Just love yourself. Many who study the Bible will tell you that when, very simply, Jesus said, as yourself, he was implying that we already do love ourselves. These other people whom I've read suggest that they can read Jesus' mind by stating that Jesus didn't see the need to explain what as yourself means, because it's a built-in system. It's a gift from God. One scholar goes on so far as to say that while a man will hold a grudge against others, he will never hold a grudge against himself. That he loves himself always, and probably too much. And that's poppycock from my perception. Here's where my understanding really departs from that. What about the man or the woman who has fallen into using drugs that has altered his mind? Or other substances? There's a ton of them out there. What about those who fail to clean themselves? I sat next to one of them on the train this week. What about those who commit suicide? I helped put one of those in the ground. Do they love themselves? People who struggle with low self-esteem, I'm not good enough, because they can't meet their goals, or they have been hurt by others' criticism, or because evil has infiltrated their soul, these people begin to experience self-hate or worthlessness. In this way, they do not love themselves. This all brings me to more questions about as yourself I would like to address. Is my definition of loving yourself, caring for your body, caring for your mind, caring for your spiritual soul, is that biblical? I say it is. But there are some, like a man named J. Adams. He's a very well-known, very well-respected Christian counselor from the 50s, 60s, 70s era. He would argue that loving yourself is not biblical. And perhaps he and I differ on the meaning, for I assume Adams bathes on occasion. In his book, which was in my library here, and I picked it up to read it, called Competent to Counsel, Adams takes the position that human beings already love themselves too much, as I mentioned earlier. In his view, we should all focus all of our love on God and our neighbors, all of our love, leaving absolutely no room for self-love. I somewhat disagree with Adams on this point. I have heard too many people refer to themselves as ugly, worthless, stupid, unlovable. I've heard people call themselves idiots to believe that everyone naturally loves themselves. Many people are stricken with self-criticism, low self-esteem, or even self-hatred. Or for those individuals, learning to love themselves might be the very thing that helps them love others more fully in order to fulfill the law. Let me repeat that. For those individuals, the ones who hate themselves, the ones who cut themselves, the ones who commit suicide, learning to love themselves might be the very thing that helps them love others more fully. And we need to find what works best to cleanse their system of their pitfalls. In some cases, we need to save their very lives. If we look at the Great Commandment, it seems to assume that loving ourselves is not just natural, but necessary. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. As yourself. This implies that we need a healthy sense of self-love to be able to fulfill this commandment. For if a man is full of hate, how could he possibly love his neighbor? This doesn't mean that self-love should become selfishness. It doesn't mean the kind of self-love that dictates the love of self in preference to others. The kind of self-love Jesus speaks of when he says, as yourself, is not about putting yourself first. It's about recognizing your worth as a child of God and treating yourself with the same kindness and the same care that you would offer someone else whom you love. And that's it. Full stop. I have a final question about all this scripture. How do we apply the concept of self-love in our lives today? So we've learned to be kind to ourselves. We've learned to like ourselves. I'm all right with myself when I get up in the mirror. It's not perfect, but I'm good with it. How do we apply this to loving our neighbor? In practice, loving one's neighbor means seeking their well-being, forgiving their offenses, avoiding vengeance, and fostering a sense of responsibility toward them. Sometimes it also means tolerating their noise or their mannerisms that are different than ours. Here's a small example. The Postal Service accidentally gives me my neighbor's mail all too frequently. Any of you experience that? You're getting somebody else's mail that lives over on Park or Elm or Locust. Some of it is obviously junk mail that ends up in my box with Tim Anderson's name on it. He's my next door neighbor. But I take it over to his house no matter what. Because frankly, if I am receiving their mail, they're probably getting my mail. And I hope they're going to give it back to me. All of it. I really want to read that piece of fake mail from the fake IRS that's telling me I owe the government $20,000 immediately. I want all that mail. I treat my neighbor the way I would want to be treated, with respect for their preferences, not mine. Remember the golden rule? The golden rule is similar to the Great Commandment. So in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. That's in 7th chapter of Matthew, verse 12, and it's called the Golden Rule. You can also find it in Luke, chapter 6. It's a good place to start to understand what Jesus meant when he said, as yourself. Treat your neighbor as you would want to be treated. Now, looking at my mail story, in terms of how I apply as yourself to this situation, I simply leave that mail on his doorstep with a note, because my neighbor's a quiet and withdrawn kind of fellow. And while he's friendly enough, he doesn't really like to visit very much. We don't stand over the fence and talk to each other, even though I'm willing. So I treat him not as if he is the same as me, but as he shows me that he wants to be treated. This is loving your neighbor. This is loving your neighbor. The standard also works with your relatives. I do not apply my standards to him, but I apply his standards to our interaction as I know them. That is the way I show godly love to my neighbor, and I hope the way he feels my neighborliness. I kind of leave him alone. I wave at him when I go by on my scooter and he waves back. Well, that's pretty much it. I always offer him, he doesn't have a basement. I always offer him our basement when the wind's blowing at 100 miles an hour. He's not ever come over for that. But we have a relationship, but it has a wall. What about those who struggle with loving themselves? What if they hate themselves or they feel worthless? For some, this can lead to really destructive behaviors like we talked about earlier, substance abuse, self-harm, or the worst, isolating themselves. Isolating themselves leads to other problems. My mother became a hermit, and in the end it wasn't pretty. Very likely there is an underlying problem, something that happened a long time ago, long unresolved, that is fostering this sad sense of being and this pulling the covers over one's head. Getting to and resolving that problem releases one to love again. And if you know someone who suffers like that, tell me about it. I'd like to help. The Bible offers a roadmap for healing and for restoration, and part of that involves recognizing the inherent worth we have as people made in God's image, and recognizing the need for everyone to know that. If we are made in God's likeness, and if God is love, then loving ourselves becomes an act of honoring the one who created us. Right? And by loving ourselves in a healthy, godly way, we are better equipped to help others. This command to love others is not just about outward acts of service. It's not about giving toilet paper to the pantry. It's about transforming inner attitudes. It's about fostering peace and justice and mutual respect, especially toward those who are different from us and those who are crying out because they're in need. And I can't emphasize enough that honoring your neighbor's preferences in the best way is the best way to love them. If your neighbor wants you to bug off, well, just wave at him when you go by. That's showing love. Unless, of course, they're turning into a hermit, in which case, call me. Loving others as ourselves requires us to step away also and turn back to look at ourselves. You didn't think you were going to get out of this sermon without me telling you to look at yourself, did you? Turn back and look at yourself. How do others see you? So, my friends, as we reflect on this commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves, we must learn to know and to love ourselves and our neighbors in a godly way so that we can extend that love to others. And in doing so, we fulfill the greatest commandments of all, to love God and to love others as ourselves. Maranatha, amen.